Thank you. Hello, everyone. 70 teams and 15 delivery managers with one mission: delivering value faster and ideally without having a breakdown. Can you imagine that we actually managed to do that? By using data, we actually managed to scale delivery management in an area that is quite large, a Just Eat takeaway. And I've come to realize that this is a problem that a lot of organizations suffer, having very few delivery managers and too much work to deliver. So I'm hoping that today, with the tricks and tips that we will show you, you will have something to take home, maybe to borrow and take credit for it. Why not? Few words about me. My name is Francesca, also known as Fran. I work at justeattakeaway.com, where I lead the team of 15 fantastic delivery managers that work in the most back-end area that there is, which is the information org. So it's a group of departments that include platform engineering, cybersecurity, compliance, data, and so on. I've had, with regards to my background, I've had quite a colorful life. I've done all the possible jobs in tech. I've started with quality engineering, moved to compliance. I've actually done compliance in China. Feel free to ask me about it later. It's interesting. And then I've done a little bit of product, and then I fell in love with delivery and kind of stuck with it. If you've been living under a rock and you don't know us, justeattakeaway.com. It's a global online food and grocery delivery marketplace. We operate in multiple countries. We have millions of customers, and we have 15,000 employees worldwide. So quite a big space to operate on. Back to how our scaling model started. Obviously, the first time I presented this talk was at justeattakeaway.com. As you do, you always like a dry run. And it was actually quite funny because initially the talk was advertised as scaled agile. And this is not what the talk is about at all. If anything, this is the story of how I failed to implement it, scaled agile. And then I had to find some solutions to then create, a structure where we could build scaled agile and other things. So 3 years ago, I became a manager for the first time. I was assigned a really large remit in the information group, which I was describing earlier. And initially, I had the ambition to implement a scaled agile model. The reason why I wanted to do that is that our teams worked in interconnected work streams and had a lot of dependencies with each other, but they were not coordinating at the best that they could potentially be. So we started exploring options. However, this was not an easy feat given the circumstances. First of all, as I said, there were very few of us. Yesterday, actually, I attended a really interesting talk about platform as a product, and the speaker said something that really resonated with me, which is in departments such as platform engineering, but also security or enterprise IT, it's really hard to get resourcing. And it's really easy to lose your job. And the reason why is that it's really hard to articulate the value of what you do when you're so upstream in the product development lifecycle. So this is exactly what happened to us. And we had very few people. The situation was even worse a few years ago when we started. We also did not have any program managers. So we didn't have anyone who would manage really complex pieces. Product was also not very present. We now have a little bit more of that, but not so much. And as a result of all of the above, we also had varying levels of skill and agile maturity across the teams, because necessarily some teams had their own delivery manager and product owner, so they were getting all the love. But then some other teams were getting nothing. So the situation was quite imbalanced. So it became very clear that what we needed was not so much a scaled agile framework, but actually we needed to create the conditions to build just about anything in that area. The solution that we found for that was a three-part solution. First and foremost, we had to define what we call a minimum delivery service coverage, which is a bare minimum of service level that delivery managers would provide to all teams at all times. Secondly, we would perform ad hoc deep dives. Probably the name suggests it, but an ad hoc deep dive is an increased focus on an opportunity or a problem area when and as needed. And then finally, self-service tools. So we would work towards providing teams with the tools that they need to do their job appropriately and in a satisfactory way. So moving on to the delivery areas focus and minimum service coverage, I need to explain a little bit what we mean by delivery management at justeattakeaway.com. I appreciate that this might look slightly different depending on the organization. So for us, delivery management is first and foremost attention to metrics. And I'm being deliberately vague here because we have an interest in just about any type of metric. We look obviously at your classic Agile metrics, your flow metrics, but also product metrics. Those are really important because at the end of the day, you want to know how your product is behaving in production. Otherwise, what are we here for? But also your DORA metrics, communication metrics, well-being metrics, and so on. We also occasionally run programs. Again, very controversial, but we do believe that in the T-shaped model, let's say, where someone is able to cover different roles at the same time. Health checks, also really important. We believe that a happy team also does great things because at the end of the day, you can't separate the products and the tools from the humans that build them. Ways of working are bread and butter. I think I still to date spend more than half of my time thinking about ways of working. That's my main focus probably. Agile practices probably don't need any introduction, but with Agile practices, we always pay attention not to be dogmatic. We don't just blanket decide everyone does Scrum, everyone does Kanban. We just help teams finding what works for them. Planning is also a part of our considerations because it defines the sequence of events that need to be achieved in order to deliver good quality products. And then backlog visualization. We need to make sure that the work is visible in some way. Some people like the physical board still, some others like Jira. As long as you can see what you're doing, that's fine. However, I'm going to pause a second here because probably given the situation that I described earlier, you can imagine that this is a lot of work. If you're a delivery manager that's operating in a space that has, let's say, 7 or 8 teams, it's too much really. And you risk burning people out. And also you're not going to do a good job at it anyway. So we had to make some difficult decisions and define the minimum service coverage. So what that meant was that we had to reduce our remit initially. And so this was the result. Of the initial remit, we decided to keep metrics, health checks, planning, and backlog management support. Now, didn't go that well initially, didn't land very well. The development teams were not too keen, stakeholders were not too keen. Even some delivery managers were a little bit confused because actually, if you look at this election that I've just shown you, it looks quite cold, aside from health checks, because metrics, planning, it feels like it takes away a little bit from the meaning of it all. However, what we need to really focus on is the fact that having a minimum service coverage doesn't mean that these are the only things we're ever going to do. It just allows us to provide the bare minimum that we give everyone. And the rationale behind that is that these areas provide us data. They provide us information about the team that then allows us to, at scale, identify what the problems and the opportunities are. And so we got to the ad hoc deep dives. So the way that works is that the delivery manager obviously works to gather all this information. To be fair, now there are a lot of tools that are able to provide this information in a very intuitive way. Apart from, running health checks, you still need to run it. But the delivery manager starts observing the data. And the data also actually includes something like relationship with the teams. I always say to people, even though we're doing the delivery minimum service coverage, we still want to stay in touch with people. We still want to make sure that we listen to them and talk to them on a regular basis. Again, can't take the human away from the product. We look at well-being metrics and health checks. Are the teams happy? Are the teams psychologically safe? Do they feel like they have a purpose and an impact? This is really important. DORA metrics, a set of metrics that we look at. By the way, this is not a conclusive list, and I think it's very subjective depending on the organization. I'm interested in DORA metrics because I am heavily involved in platform engineering. Somewhere else, you might decide that that's not as relevant, and maybe there is something else. Agile and flow metrics, of course, they're part of a consideration, but on this one, I always try and put these metrics into context, because I have actually seen teams that have perfect throughput, but then actually the delivery gets stuck in terms of, full deliverables. And then also product metrics, as I was saying. So when it's all said and done, are our products actually doing what we wanted them to do in production, or do we need to pivot and plan differently? So the way this works is that the delivery manager analyzes the information, and let's say they spot an issue or an opportunity from one data point. What happens next is that the data is then compared to other data sets. So we never take one data point as true. And this is valid for probably anything in life. You should never stop at the first indicator. You should always compare it and review it to validate whether the information is true. The same applies here. If the issue is actually confirmed, the delivery manager then talks to the team and proposes an engagement, a coaching engagement, to then resolve the problem. This is actually really important because we don't force coaching over people. There needs to be also an acknowledgement and an agreement with the team, because otherwise it just becomes really, really difficult to achieve that. And also, we should never be arrogant, especially considering the fact that in this system, we are not in the day-to-day of the team. So we need to be also happy to admit that we might be wrong with our assumptions. So always approach the problem with humility and with a scientific method. If the coaching goes well, the problem is resolved, the delivery manager then ends that specific engagement with that team, and the cycle restarts and they find something else. There can be simultaneous engagements depending on the size, but I always would invite to not multitasking. Practice what we preach with the teams. I'm going to give you an example of how this works, because practice is always miles away from theory. So I'm going to tell you a story of something that actually happened. A delivery manager ran health checks in a set of teams. Now, a Just Eat Takeaway, we actually don't use the Spotify health check. I love it. We just don't use that one. What we use actually is a version of the Google 5 characteristics of high-performing teams. We changed it to add some areas and we tweaked it a little bit. So the way this health check works is that it's actually kind of similar to the Spotify health check. So you will have your mirror board, or we use Team Retro as well. And effectively, there are these 6 areas, and they get scored by the teams from 1 to 6. 1 being really poor and 6 being really good. The 6 areas are psychological safety. So how safe does the team feel to speak their mind with each other and with the management layers above? Well, we actually used to differentiate, because I've learned that the scores can be very different between these 2 variants. Dependability shows whether or not the team feel like they can rely on each other to do good quality work. Structure and clarity shows us whether or not the team has the right tools, information, infrastructure to do the work that they need to do. Meaning of work is more meant to identify whether or not the team feel like they have a sense of purpose with the work that they do. They're not just there to kind of do the 8 hours and go home. They're actually excited by their mission. Impact of work is kind of similar, but it's more focused on the stakeholder side of things. So do we feel like we're actually making a difference for others? And then speed. Speed is the perception of whether or not the team is fast enough to deliver value. In this example, the delivery manager spotted a decrease in the overall score for speed. Now, speed is something that, in my experience, teams tend to be very harsh on themselves about, actually. They're never really fully satisfied. But in this case, it was really an outlier. So there was a drop if we looked at the trend over time. So what happened next is that the delivery manager started comparing that to other data sets. What I was saying earlier about not trusting the first data point, especially applies to health checks, because with a health checks are based on feelings, whether we like it or not. So someone could have a really, really bad day and the health check scores drop. So we really need to compare that with what's happening in reality. And in this one case, actually, there was a progressive increase in cycle time, decrease in throughput, and so on. The data-driven findings were confirmed by the team. The team said, yep, we definitely have that problem. It was just not the mood. It was not just the mood of the day. And then they asked for help to resolve the issue. So what happened next is that the delivery manager started observing the team, working with them, acting in team a little bit like a scrum master. And they started seeing a really strange situation where the work in progress queue had become really, really big. Like they had a lot of bottlenecks. And also on top of that, they had some blockers on external teams. They had a lot of blockers. So there were also some patterns in terms of these blockers. So they didn't have blockers on various teams. It was always the same ones. And that was because to deliver certain pieces, they actually had a dependency on the same teams. It was really, what was emerging at the time was that there was an organizational design problem, because effectively different teams were owning different parts of the infrastructure. And on top of that, they were also not coordinating with each other when they had to deliver. So the delivery manager started coaching the team a little bit in the dependency mapping and also coordinating with the receiving teams. The other behavior that emerged from this was the fact that because the team was getting stuck on external teams, they started dragging more work in progress. So they were creating more bottlenecks and they were creating a more chaotic situation for themselves. So the solution effectively was coaching the teams on principles such as little slow, but also there were chats initially to start, handing over parts of the infrastructure so that the delivery would not be as painful all the time, because that was at the end of the day the key problem that was happening. Obviously, this was a long journey, definitely not a 2-minute one, but it was quite resolved. And in the end, the delivery manager ended their engagement and started another one. Self-service tools, I really like these ones because when it's all said and done, we are still not in the team in the day-to-day. And I also like the idea of the team feeling empowered to actually find their way through Agile, through their ways of working. At the end of the day, we think even of how Scrum started, we didn't have a specific role for a Scrum Master. It was an engineer that would take that role. And that happens a lot in the industry. So this is not a behavior that we want to discourage, especially in a situation like that. So to do that, we started providing some tools so that the teams could self-serve in terms of these needs. Again, very subjective, depending on the organization. But what worked for us was having metrics dashboards. My team created some really wonderful easy BI dashboards where with one view, you would see all the metrics of interest of the entire department. So you could literally spot the trends and how things are going, which is really easy to use. We then moved on to a software that is called Jellyfish, which is also quite good. But to be honest, this can be done without external vendors and external tools. It just needs a little bit of time for setup. And also, another point to note is that metrics dashboards were also born out of feedback from the engineers themselves. They said, oh, you're extracting all of these metrics for us, but what if I want to just consult them when you're not around? So that was really good to hear and really good piece of input. How to documentation. Yeah, don't underestimate the power of a Confluence page. I know that they can be a bore and I know they're hard to maintain, but actually people do read them. Like if they need a certain type of information, if that information is vital for them, they do use them. Team assessments. I actually don't have that. I keep putting it on slides when I do the talk because I'm hoping that someone just gives me an easy solution to that. So the idea behind that, and actually we started talking about it in the team, was creating a questionnaire that would then give us a sense of the agile maturity of a certain team that does that assessment. And we thought there's something that could be done with AI potentially with that. But whenever we tried to venture that, we were not quite happy with the result. It felt like it was taking the essence of what agility is out of it. So I haven't really found a solution to that, but I'm still hopeful that maybe someone at some point will come to me with that. So if you have ideas, or if you're looking for a business idea, here you are. Project management handbooks. There was a member of my team that actually did the Google course of project management, and they actually created a bit of a simplified version of that for our teams so that, tech leads could run their own projects. Of course, for bigger pieces, because program management is a skill set in itself, you want the specialist, but it's a type of skill set that you want to dedicate to the highest value pieces. For small projects, maybe leaning towards self-serving could be a good alternative. And then training. One of the nicest thing that I think we've ever done was something called an Agile Leadership Academy that the coaching org at Just Eat Takeaway actually run to teach effectively tech leads and product leads what Agile is and how to run ways of working in teams structured in this way, which was really cool and was met with a lot of enthusiasm. Lessons learned, because it was not all smooth sailing. And actually, I think the best part of implementing something like this is the learning that there are along the way. This looks nothing like the way it started. So first of all, there is a human tendency of still wanting to do it all. I've observed it in my team. When we said, okay, we're doing the minimum service coverage, people will go, yeah, we're going to do that. But then they started trying to be a scrum master in every single team. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. We need to really practice what we preach with the teams, which is ruthlessly prioritize the highest value item. And when we prioritize, a piece of advice that I feel like giving everyone is to dream big and think in ecosystem. The reason why I say that is that you probably have observed in your careers teams that had the best agile implementations, like they ran all their processes just fine, and yet still didn't manage to deliver. And who knows why? And the reason, more often than not, is that they were probably in an ecosystem, in a department that probably wasn't agile. And so they were being prevented from actually delivering the value. So when we prioritize, let's try and think about what is the issue that impacts the largest area, the most impactful thing. Of course, large doesn't necessarily mean better, but if you think about it in terms of systems, it kind of makes sense. This is not a system that it's designed just for understaffed delivery orgs like we were. Obviously, this was created because we didn't know how to proceed. But this is something that could be replicated in an area where you have the luxury of many delivery managers, many scrum masters. This is how it works. So the system that I've just explained up until now, as an example, has one delivery manager every 6 teams. They do their analysis, they do their deep dive, and then they repeat. But as an example, if you had 2 or 3 delivery managers, what could happen would be that the delivery managers could look at the data together. I think there is a lot of beauty in people looking at problems together. There is a lot of learning. People learn from each other, and people spot each other's mistakes as well. So the delivery managers would run their analysis together. They would run multiple simultaneous deep dives. They could be connected. They don't have to be. And then, regroup, learn together, and repeat. There is a lot of merit into that. And I really love inviting delivery managers to work a little bit like engineers when they do pair programming. There is a lot of learning in there, especially if you have junior people. Another big learning is that, yes, I said, obviously, it's a 2-way street. We want to make sure that teams accept our coaching, but it does happen that sometimes delivery managers receive really strange requests, like the ones listed on the screen. My favorite is, can you schedule our meetings? like the amount of time that this has happened, or like tidy up the backlog or prioritize the backlog, which is a product job. Obviously, we always come from a place of empathy. And I also appreciate the fact that reality is very complex. And I've scheduled meetings before for people when it was necessary. But we always need to take this with a pinch of salt. I see it a bit like making tea for your team. Yeah, of course, sometimes you do that, right? Who wouldn't? But if that becomes your entire job, then you need to ask yourself a couple of questions of whether or not you've understood what the role is. Because actually there is so many better things that a delivery manager can do in a team than, organizing the meetings or running all of the stand-ups. I was talking earlier about the fact that teams had varying levels of agile maturity in our area, because some teams had a stable delivery manager who was giving them all the love, and some other teams got nothing. So the teams that got nothing obviously got really happy because they started receiving something, effectively, at least the minimum service coverage, which was an improvement. But then the other ones ended up being really quite upset because actually they started perceiving like they were receiving less. They couldn't quite grasp what we were doing. They thought that we would just decided to do half the job effectively. And the solution to that was patience. So effectively sitting down with the teams, explaining why we were doing and how our focus from now on was going to be the system rather than the individual teams, so that all teams could thrive. So there needs to be a lot of communication for sure on these topics. There is a whole aspect about managing expectations. So I said some of the teams were complaining about the fact that we were changing this approach. I remember one of the earliest complaints that I received from one of our stakeholders was the fact that their retrospectives were not being run anymore. Effectively, we stopped running the retrospectives because up until that point, the delivery manager was taking care of all the ceremonies. And so they said, we need our retrospectives. What is preventing you from running 7 retrospectives in a space of 2 weeks? Now, apart from the feasibility of that, it's also a matter of prioritizing what the highest value item was. So instead of getting defensive, what I did was I sat down with them and I tried to apply the business analysis technique of the 5 whys, which is, okay, but why do you need these retrospectives? Oh, because I need them. But why? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And after a little bit of digging, what emerged was that the stakeholder was unhappy about the planning processes that that team had. So effectively, they needed the retrospective to repeatedly discuss the problems that were happening over the sprints. So I said, okay, shall we work on planning then? It feels like we have an upstream problem to resolve that is bigger than just the retrospective every 2 weeks. So that worked. Always involve them in prioritization decisions. As I said, we come from a place of humility, not of arrogance. We listen to them, and also we ask their opinions about what to prioritize, because it's very easy when I explain it on paper, but in reality, sometimes it's really hard to actually prioritize the biggest value items. So let's work together as a team. That will always be my recommendation. This is a change, of course, and it's a bit of an unusual piece of change. So we need to make sure that we land it appropriately in order to be successful. And there is no silver bullet with regards to that, because the way you communicate things in a flat organization, as an example, is different than the way you communicate into a very hierarchical organization. I know we don't like it. I know we would prefer everything to be flat, but that's just not reality sometimes. So if your organization is hierarchical, go to the top, explain the system to the top and let it trickle down. If it's flat, talk to the individual teams and move that way. Try and think about where you're landing the message. This is important for this system and for everything, really. And also, a very important aspect is actually promoting delivery management. I've witnessed a lot of behaviors from delivery managers where they wanted to be the unsung hero, effectively, not training, not taking the credit, trying to do everything for others, which is beautiful. But I think it's important that the stakeholders know, that stakeholders, the teams, know what we can actually achieve, what we can do, because there is so much different that can be made even with just one deep dive. So in a nutshell, the key for this and anything else in agility, I think, is communication. Thank you very much.